Hello and welcome to the Physionic podcast. Today's topic is a heavy one, but it's a topic that I was asked about relatively recently, and I went into this whole spiel kind of explaining why this occurs, and I thought that it would be a benefit to many people to understand why cancer comes back. Why is it that if you have cancer and you defeat cancer and you get past that 5-year timetable that a lot of clinicians use, why does cancer then relapse in many cases? Certainly not all cases, but in many cases. And there are three primary reasons that I'm going to discuss this in, but just because you reach that 5-year mark does not mean that you are necessarily cancer-free. That's just a marker that clinicians use to determine if a person has made it up to a particular amount of time, and 5 years is a good amount of time to have survived cancer. In terms of will it ever come back, well, usually the chances are actually pretty decently high, depending, of course, on the type of cancer. So the first thing is that when we quote-unquote kill cancer, we're just eliminating what we can actually measure. So if you take a film, or if you take some sort of image of your cancer, of the tumor, and they use, let's say, chemotherapy, or they use some sort of radiation to eliminate it, you see that tumor starts to shrink and eventually it gets to a point where it's undetectable. But that's the key point. It's undetectable. That does not, however, mean that cancer is gone. It just means that you've beaten it back to the shores of almost being destroyed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is destroyed. So just because our technology can't detect it does not mean that it doesn't exist. It could mean that it doesn't exist anymore, but it doesn't definitively mean that it doesn't exist. So getting a result of no cancer is a great sign, and our technology is not detecting anything, which is fantastic. And we usually use an array of different measures. That still does not 100% guarantee that you've beaten back cancer to a point where it's completely eliminated. So that's reason number one. The second reason is cancer is a devilish disease. And again, depending on the type of cancer that you're talking about, particular cancers, when stressed enough through something like chemotherapy, something highly toxic, cancer cells can become what's called quiescent. Quiescent is essentially a dormant state where they essentially close in and stop proliferating. They start growing, or they stop growing, and they stop splitting into new cells and rapidly expanding the actual tumor size. They completely halt, and you may be able to kill many of them, but certain ones can become incredibly resilient by becoming quiescent. So essentially, a chemotherapy may stop the total growth of a particular cell, but if that cell has preempted that chemotherapy by stopping its own growth for a period of time, yes, it is that scary, it is that crazy that a cell can do that. There are some incredibly amazing aspects of that as well that our body does in a physiological state, but in a pathophysiological state like cancer, yes, you can have situations in which these cells will turn themselves off with the idea that once the stress goes away, that it will turn itself back on and start to replicate again. Mind-blowing, I know, but it does happen. So that's reason number two. It becomes more resilient in that aspect. And the third way is that cancer can mutagenize, essentially saying that cancer may be caused by a particular mutant gene or a series of genes, and you find a cure for that mutant level, for that particular expression of those genes. So you eliminate all those cells, but lo and behold, one of those cells or many of those cells have remutated to a different form of cancer, to a slight different variation that your treatment no longer cures or your treatment no longer works on. And in that way, then it starts to proliferate and starts to grow again. So in those three ways, cancer can come back. And I realize that's not exactly an encouraging thought, but technology is getting better. It's actually getting incredibly good. And our body is incredibly resilient, and we will keep pushing forward. And just by the pace of medicine and where it's going, there is a substantial amount of hope for the future. But just know that cancer, if anything, is incredibly adaptive. Mutagenizes, that's not even a word. Just mutagenizes, still probably not even a word. But you get my point. It adapts massively. It's incredibly, incredibly complex. And that's why it's so hard to pinpoint any one cure for cancer. And even if we find a cure for a particular patient, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be cured forever because of these three reasons, but certainly far more than just these three reasons. I just want you to understand that cancer is incredibly vicious and it's hard to pinpoint. You can't knock it over the head as easily as people might think that we just need this one cure and it's just going to fix everything. It's certainly not the case when it comes to cancer. All right. Hopefully that was informative for you. Hopefully you learned something out of this episode. And I hope that I have the pleasure of speaking with you in the next one. Have a good one, guys. Bye.